During my research on virtues and how they have changed over time, I came across an interesting idea from C.S. Lewis. He talks about a significant shift in how we understand what it means to be a virtuous person. In the past, great Christian thinkers believed that love was the greatest virtue. But today many people see self-denial, that is, giving up things for the benefit of others, as the most important virtue. This change made me curious and made me think about what it really means. Self-denial, as we see it today, seems to be an end in itself, as if the act of renouncing our own desires was the main point. But Lewis suggests that this idea is different from what Christianity originally taught. For him, renunciation was not an end, but a means to achieve something greater, to follow Christ and seek the joy and fulfillment he offers. As I deepened my investigation, I realized that there are alarming dangers in adopting self-denial as an end in itself. This excessive focus on renunciation can lead to a negative view of life, where suffering and deprivation are unnecessarily exalted, and the very pursuit of happiness is seen almost as a sin. This understanding can distance us from the true purpose of Christian life, which is to love and find joy in God and others. By neglecting this pursuit of fuller joy, we run the risk of turning virtue into something rigid and empty, where renunciation becomes just a form of self-punishment. As I continued my research, I realized that perhaps this modern view has been influenced by philosophers like Kant and the Stoics, who valued the idea of renouncing personal desires. And by following this line of thinking, have we moved away from the Christian teaching that has always spoken about the pursuit of happiness, as long as it was a happiness that brought good to everyone? For Lewis, the issue is not that we desire too much, but that we desire too little, contenting ourselves with momentary pleasures and ignoring the infinite joy that God offers us. Consider this striking passage from The Weight of Glory that sums up exactly the topic I want to address in this video. If you ask 20 righteous men of our day which they believe to be the greatest of the virtues, 19 would reply self-denial. But if you asked any of the great Christians of the past, they would say love. Do you see what has happened? The positive term has been replaced by a negative, and the importance of this fact transcends the field of philology. The negative ideal of self-denial basically carries with it the notion not of seeking the benefit of others, but of our dispensing with that benefit, as if the important thing were not the happiness of others, but our abstention. I do not think this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has much to say about renunciation, but not of renunciation as an end in itself. It tells us we must deny ourselves and take up our cross in order to follow Christ. And almost all descriptions of the reward that will follow this renunciation contain an appeal to the natural desire for happiness. If today the notion that it is wrong to desire our happiness and to look forward to enjoying it lurks in most minds, I assert that it arose in Kant or the Stoics, but not in the Christian faith. In fact, if we consider the immodest promises of reward and the astonishing nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, we would say that our Lord considers our desires not too great, but too little. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition, when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. To understand how the view of virtues has changed over time, it is important to observe the historical and philosophical context in which this transformation occurred. C.S. Lewis points to a fundamental difference between the values of ancient Christianity and the mindset that has consolidated in modern times. While the great Christian thinkers of the past saw love as the supreme virtue, self-denial, the act of renouncing personal desires for the good of others, has been exalted as the greatest of virtues in contemporary thought. But what caused this change in perspective? The answer can be found in part in the philosophical influences that shaped Western thought. Philosophers like Immanuel Kant and the Stoics played a fundamental role in valuing renunciation and duty as central aspects of morality. Kant, for example, argued that true morality lies in duty for duty's sake, regardless of rewards or personal motivations. He believed that moral action should be disinterested, that is, done without seeking any personal benefit. This thinking influenced the idea that virtue lies in giving up individual desires, creating a view where self-denial is seen as an end in itself. The Stoics, in turn, preached detachment from pleasures and emotions as a path to inner peace. For them, virtue consisted in serenely accepting what one cannot control, including renouncing desires and worldly pleasures. This philosophy also contributed to the idea that a virtuous life is one that moves away from personal desires in search of an ideal of balance and self-control. However, when we compare these influences with the Christian tradition, we notice a significant difference. In Christianity, especially in the words of Jesus in the New Testament, renunciation is not seen as a final goal, but as a necessary step towards something greater, following Christ and achieving a full life. The focus is on love for God and others, and renunciation is just a means to achieve this total surrender to love. Christianity does not condemn the desire for happiness, but rather the pursuit of limited and superficial happiness. Over time, these philosophical ideas about self-denial have mixed with Christian thought and, in many cases, have ended up replacing the ideal of love as the supreme virtue. The modern view that it is noble to give up one's own happiness for the good of others may thus have deeper roots in the philosophies of Kant and the Stoics than in the original teachings of Jesus. This difference in perspectives helps us better understand why. Today, many consider self-denial as the greatest of virtues, while ancient Christians pointed to love. This discovery leads us to reflect. Has this change in focus brought us closer to or further away from the true purpose of Christianity? And to what extent have these philosophical influences altered our understanding of what it means to live a virtuous life? These questions prepare us to deepen the analysis in the following topics, where we will explore the impacts of this modern view and C.S. Lewis's proposal to rescue the value of love and the pursuit of deeper happiness. When self-denial is seen as an end in itself, several dangers arise that can lead the individual away from the true purpose of Christian life. This excessive focus on renunciation can result in a distorted view of virtue, where suffering and deprivation are unnecessarily exalted, and the pursuit of happiness is considered suspect or even wrong. This approach contrasts deeply with the biblical message, which values renunciation, but always as a means to a greater goal, love and a relationship with God and others. Focusing only on renunciation can create a mindset where Christian life is seen primarily as a path of pain and sacrifice, and not as a journey of love and joy. This type of perspective can lead to what many call toxic asceticism, an attitude where the deprivation of any pleasure is considered a virtue in itself. Instead of actively and joyfully seeking the good of others, this view often leads to self-punishment, where one's own happiness is seen as something to be avoided. However, the Bible offers a different perspective on Christian life. In John 10:10, Jesus says, "I have come that they may have life, and have it to the full. This verse suggests that Jesus' purpose is to offer a full and rich life, which includes experiencing true joy in a relationship with Him. The excessive focus on renunciation risks distorting this message, turning faith into something restrictive rather than liberating. The Bible recognizes the value of renunciation, but always in service of a greater purpose. In Matthew 16:24, Jesus says, "If anyone wants to follow me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." This call to renunciation has a clear purpose: to follow Christ. The emphasis is on the direction of renunciation. It allows us to set aside our selfish desires so that we can follow a path of love and service. Renunciation here is a means to be closer to God and serve others more fully. Furthermore, in Hebrews 12:2, we see an example of how Jesus dealt with the idea of sacrifice and joy. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Here, the Bible shows us that Jesus endured the cross, not just as an act of renunciation, but because of the joy that would come afterwards. This reminds us that Christian renunciation should be motivated by a vision of something greater, a joy and a good that go beyond the sacrifice itself. Another danger of focusing too much on renunciation is the risk of false humility or spiritual pride. When someone believes that the simple act of renouncing pleasures and comforts makes him a more virtuous or holy person, this can lead to an attitude of moral superiority over others. Jesus criticized this type of attitude on several occasions. In Matthew 6:16-18, he warns against those who fast to be seen by others, suggesting that they have already received their reward. Jesus emphasizes that true renunciation should be discreet, focused on God, and not on gaining human recognition. This passage shows us that renunciation should not be used to impress or to gain a status of virtue. When the focus is only on showing how much we are capable of giving up, we lose sight of true humility, which is to serve others without seeking recognition. Finally, focusing only on renunciation can cause us to lose sight of the central purpose of Christianity, love. The Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians 13:3, makes a powerful statement about the priority of love. "If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing." This shows that mere renunciation, even if extreme, has no value if it is not motivated by love. What Paul tells us is that sacrifice for the sake of sacrifice is not what God desires from us. He wants our actions to be guided by true and sincere love for others. This teaching of Paul reinforces C.S. Lewis's critique of the idea that self-denial should be an end goal. For our actions to truly reflect Christian virtue, they must be driven by a love that seeks the good of others, and, as a consequence, also finds genuine and lasting joy. At this point, it is important to delve into C.S. Lewis's view on the relationship between desire, happiness, and virtue, which contrasts with the modern idea that the desire for happiness can be an obstacle to morality. For Lewis, the problem is not that we desire too much, but that we desire too little. We content ourselves with passing joys and superficial pleasures, ignoring the promise of greater joy offered by God. This perspective invites us to reconsider how we understand the pursuit of happiness in Christian life. Lewis argues that the modern view of self-denial often presents the desire for happiness as something suspect as if the mere fact of wanting to be happy were a deviation from true virtue. However, he challenges this idea, suggesting that the Bible and the teachings of Jesus do not condemn the desire for joy, but on the contrary, recognize that the desire for happiness is part of human nature. Lewis's critique is that by rejecting the desire for happiness, we end up seeking lesser pleasures, ignoring the infinite joy that God offers. One of the most impactful examples of his critique is the metaphor of the child who is content to play with mud pies in a slum, unable to imagine what accepting an invitation to a holiday at the beach would mean. This image represents the way many people, including Christians, cling to small worldly pleasures such as success, material comfort, or even the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, instead of seeking a deeper and more enduring happiness in God. Lewis suggests that our desires are not too strong, but too weak, and that the modern view of self-denial leads us to settle for too little when there is something much greater within our reach. Lewis's view is deeply rooted in the biblical tradition, which sees joy as a legitimate goal for human beings. In several passages of the New Testament, there are promises of full and lasting happiness for those who follow God. A clear example is Psalm 37. 4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. This verse suggests that the pursuit of joy is not incompatible with faith, but that, on the contrary, it can be directed correctly when it is found in God. In the New Testament, Jesus also makes various promises of reward to those who renounce themselves to follow him, but these promises always include the idea of future joy. In Matthew 5:12, when speaking of the Beatitudes, he says, "Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven." Here, Jesus does not deny the desire for happiness. Instead, he redirects that desire to something higher. True Christian renunciation, therefore, is not the denial of desire itself, but the exchange of a passing pleasure for eternal joy. Lewis emphasizes that, far from being a negative virtue that merely seeks to avoid pleasure, Christianity offers a rich vision of the desire for something greater and more fulfilling. The very concept of reward or recompense in the Scriptures points to the idea that God recognizes and values the desire for joy. For example, in Hebrews 11:6 we read, "And without faith it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." This suggests that the desire to find reward in God is not only acceptable, but expected. For Lewis, it is precisely this promise of joy that drives us to live a life of love and service to others. Christian renunciation, when properly understood, is a way of giving up lesser pleasures to receive something incomparably better. Thus, it is not about rejecting happiness, but about seeking the deeper happiness that comes from a relationship with God. Self-denial is not the ultimate goal, but a necessary step to make room in our hearts for the joy that God offers us. Lewis's view of desire and happiness also offers an important counterpoint to the modern mindset, which often sees sacrifice and deprivation as synonyms for virtue. For Lewis, the real challenge is to realize that God does not want us to content ourselves with small and fleeting pleasures, but to have the courage to seek the true and complete joy that he promises. This vision calls us to abandon a limited spirituality and embrace the hope of full joy. This perspective may be especially relevant in a world that, on the one hand, values immediate pleasure, and, on the other, often condemns the desire for spiritual happiness as something naive. Lewis's proposal is an invitation to recover the depth of Christian teaching on desire and happiness, where renunciation is a means to find a joy that never ends. Lewis's critique leads us to reflect on how we understand the role of desire and happiness in our lives. By realizing that the problem is not desiring too much, but rather contenting ourselves with too little, we can realign our spiritual pursuit. The Christian life does not need to be marked only by renunciation, but by a vibrant hope in the promise of joy that God offers. This vision challenges us to go beyond a spirituality of empty sacrifices and to seek a life of true love, where renunciation is just part of the path to a deeper and more complete happiness in God. With this perspective, we can approach a more balanced understanding of virtue, where the desire for joy is not seen as an obstacle, but as a path that leads us to discover what it truly means to live according to the love and generosity that God teaches us. In the end, C.S. Lewis's reflection challenges us to look at Christianity in a way that rescues its essence, a journey that is not limited to renunciation, but that leads us to true love and deeper joy. He reminds us that the purpose of giving up some things is not just to deprive ourselves of pleasure, but to make room for something much greater, a life that reflects the goodness of God and finds satisfaction in doing good. Lewis's message invites us not to content ourselves with little, but to seek a life of love that is truly transformative, both for ourselves and for those around us. This pursuit of genuine joy is not a deviation from the Christian faith, but rather a fundamental part of it. After all, as Jesus promised, he came so that we may have life and have it abundantly. In summary, by understanding that the desire for happiness can be aligned with true love, we are encouraged to live more fully, embracing both renunciation and the joy it can bring us. In doing so, we are not just denying ourselves, but opening up to a greater purpose and to the happiness that God calls us to experience. In doing so, we become more capable of loving and living a life that truly reflects the essence of Christianity.